In the year 1377, during the fragile final decade of the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital of Constantinople was a city at once magnificent and rotting. Its domes still gleamed under the sun, its walls still stood defiant against the encroaching Ottomans. But within those walls, the court was fractured. The emperor Andronikos IV Palaiologos had inherited a realm weakened by civil war, debt, and the shifting alliances of treacherous nobles. The treasury was nearly empty, the once great army now a shadow of its former might, often unpaid, restless, and unpredictable. In these final years, paranoia reigned more absolutely than law. Within the imperial palace, every marble corridor carried whispers that could either elevate a man to power or destroy him utterly. The Byzantines had long known that the most dangerous battlefield was not the frontier, but the court itself. Here, loyalty was fluid, truth was relative, and survival often depended not on one's sword, but on one's silence. The man who would learn this most brutally was Michael Parakesios, a low-born but unusually gifted political advisor. Rising from the ranks of palace scribes, Michael had earned the emperor's notice by his skill with accounts, his grasp of foreign trade, and his rare unwillingness to flatter without reason. But that same forthright nature, so refreshing in times of stability, was a mortal liability in an era when rulers were desperate to preserve their own authority. By the winter of that year, famine had begun to grip the poorer districts of Constantinople. Grain imports had been disrupted by Ottoman blockades, and what little food entered the city was hoarded by merchants with imperial ties. In the emperor's council chamber, gilded with icons and tapestries, Michael made the fatal mistake of speaking too plainly. He urged the emperor to abandon certain costly ceremonial projects and redirect funds to purchase grain. He warned that unrest in the streets could lead to open rebellion. Most dangerous of all, he hinted that certain alliances, particularly with Genoese merchants who now enjoyed imperial favor, were draining the empire's resources for their own gain. It was not only the emperor who heard him. Also present were members of the palace guard loyal to the Genoese, and eunuch officials whose fortunes depended on the very policies Michael condemned. Within hours, his words were repeated in the private quarters of the empress's family, a clan already suspicious of Michael's influence. In the Byzantine legal tradition, there existed a punishment reserved for those whose words were seen as destabilizing the state tongue, cutting. It was not merely a means of silencing dissent, but a public demonstration of imperial power. To strip a man of speech was to remove his political identity entirely, for in Constantinople, where debates shaped policy and rhetoric was an art, a man without a tongue was a man without existence. Michael was arrested at dusk. There was no trial. Such proceedings were unnecessary when the emperor's will had been made clear. Bound at the wrists and ankles, he was taken to the underground chamber beneath the palace of Blachernae. The room smelled faintly of incense and iron, its walls hung with icons whose saints gazed down with impassive eyes. There, a physician of the court, himself bound by oath to carry out punishments as decreed, prepared the instruments, a sharpened iron blade, a heated brazier, and cloths to stanch the bleeding. Contemporary accounts describe the act in sparse but chilling detail. The tongue was seized with iron tongs, drawn forward, and severed in a single motion. The cauterization that followed was not for mercy, but for efficiency, to prevent death from blood loss before the punishment could be publicly displayed. Michael's screams, muffled and short-lived, echoed through the stone corridors. When it was over, he could make only guttural sounds, the voice that had once challenged the emperor now reduced to a wet rasp. But the horror was not confined to the physical act. The Byzantines understood the symbolic destruction they had wrought. The next day, Michael was paraded through the city streets, his mouth bound in linen stained dark with blood. Bystanders watched in silence, some in pity, others in fear, all reminded that the line between loyalty and ruin was as thin as a whispered phrase. Deprived of his role in the palace, Michael was exiled to a remote monastery on the island of Proti. There, surrounded by the cold waters of the Sea of Marmara, he lived out his remaining years in obscurity, unable to participate in the political life that had once defined him. Even in death, His burial was unmarked by name, another layer of erasure, to ensure that no memory of descent could inspire others. The empire itself would not last much longer. Less than a century later, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, ending the Byzantine state forever. But in the chronicles of certain monastic scribes, the story of Michael Parakesios endured, not as a rallying cry, but as a caution. It was said that in the palace, the stones themselves remembered his words, but the men who heard them chose to forget. In the late autumn of 1422, in the court of Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, justice was not a shield but a weapon. The Byzantine Empire, reduced by centuries of decline, had become a place where survival depended less on loyalty to the throne than on skill in navigating the shifting alliances of noble families. The Ottomans were tightening their hold around the empire's remaining lands, yet inside the city walls, the greatest threats to the emperor's authority came not from armies, but from words spoken in the wrong company. The accused that season was Demetrios Rodios, a provincial tax officer whose career had begun in the dusty archives of Thessaloniki and risen, by diligence rather than favor, to a position in the imperial revenue office. His task had been to account for grain levies sent from the countryside to the capital. But his reports had begun to trouble the palace. They spoke openly of shortages, of corrupt middlemen diverting shipments for private profit, and, most dangerous of all, of a network of imperial relatives complicit in the theft. It was not what Demetrios had written that sealed his fate. It was who had read it. One copy of his report, intended for an honest member of the Senate, had instead found its way into the hands of a cousin of the emperor. The reaction was immediate. In the fragile ecosystem of the court, even the appearance of dissent could be treated as treason. The summons came at night. 2 palace guards, robed not in the gold of ceremony, but in the dark crimson of the emperor's private service, arrived at Demetrios's quarters. They offered no explanation, only the command to follow. In the flickering lamplight of the streets, they led him through narrow passages into the great palace complex, past the sleeping gardens and shuttered galleries, until they reached a low, arched doorway guarded by men who did not speak. This was not the public hall of trials. This was the Synodos Crypti, the hidden council. Trials here were not held to weigh evidence, but to make a verdict appear inevitable. The chamber into which Demetrios was led was small but oppressive. Candles burned in iron sconces, their wax pooling like coagulated blood along the walls. The air was thick with incense, not to sanctify the proceeding, but to mask the closeness of the room, the staleness of breath and authority. 3 judges sat at a long table draped in black, their faces half lit by the shifting flame. Behind them, a court scribe recorded every word, not as it was spoken, but as it would be remembered. The charges were read in the formal Greek of the court, but their meaning was clear slander against the imperial family, distribution of false reports, incitement of unrest among the provinces. There was no mention of the names implicated in his writings, no discussion of the evidence, because in truth, there was no need. The purpose of the trial was not to discover guilt, but to display that it had already been decided. Demetrios was allowed to speak, but only briefly. His voice, calm yet taut, denied the charges and appealed to the emperor's sense of justice. It was a futile gesture. The chief judge, a eunuch of the palace who had served 3 emperors, leaned forward and announced that while the accused's words were unfit for the ears of the people, his life would be spared as a gesture of imperial mercy. The sentence was glōssokopēsis, the cutting out of the tongue. This was no random cruelty. It was an ancient Byzantine punishment for political dissent, chosen for its symbolism. To take a man's tongue was to remove not just his voice, but his role in the civic life of the empire. Without the power to speak, he could neither accuse nor defend, neither rally others nor plead his case. The execution of the sentence was immediate. 2 guards escorted Demetrios from the chamber to a smaller, colder room. There, a physician waited, his instruments laid out upon a narrow table. The tools were simple iron tongs, a short bladed knife, and a brazier of glowing coals. Contemporary monastic accounts, though written in the restrained language of chroniclers, still convey the horror of the act. The prisoner's head was forced back, His jaw pried open, the tongue grasped and pulled forward. In a single motion, the blade severed it at the base. The sound, witnesses wrote, was a wet snap followed by a rush of breath that could no longer form words. Blood spilled freely, and the cauterization that followed filled the room with the smell of burned flesh, a smell that clung to clothes long after the act was done. When it was over, Demetrios was gagged with linen to staunch the bleeding. By morning, he was placed upon a mule and paraded through the streets of Constantinople, his mouth still bound. The sight was more than a warning. It was a declaration that the emperor's justice could reach into the soul of a man and remove the part that made him dangerous. From there, he was exiled to the fortress at Limnos, a small island in the northern Aegean. The climate was harsh, the garrison indifferent, and the isolation absolute. Without the ability to speak, Demetrios relied on writing, though most of his letters were confiscated before leaving the island. Those that survived show a script shaky but deliberate, filled with laments not for his suffering, but for the empire's decay. He died there 5 years later, of illness made worse by malnutrition. His body was buried outside the fortress walls, denied the rights of a citizen. No marker bore his name. The irony, perhaps unintentional, was that his silence did not preserve the court's dignity. It preserved his memory. The scribes who had once worked beside him whispered of his fate, and long after the empire's fall, his story appeared in the margins of monastic chronicles, a cautionary note in the records of a dying world. It was the spring of 1441, and the city of Constantinople still clung to its grandeur even as its borders shrank. The Byzantine Empire had become a fragment of its former self, a city of gold mosaics and broken walls, where the ceremonial rituals of power often hid the desperate fragility of the throne. Public punishments were an old tradition in the empire, borrowed in part from Roman law and adapted to Byzantine political needs. Executions were rare for certain crimes, not because the rulers were merciful, but because some punishments served better as lessons when the condemned remained alive to be seen. Among these, none was more feared than glōssokopēsis, the cutting of the tongue. On the day of the sentence, the open square in front of the Augusteion was prepared. The Augusteion was more than a market square, it was the ceremonial heart of the capital, where imperial decrees were read aloud, victories celebrated, and, on darker days, punishments carried out before the people. For the condemned, there was no hiding from the eyes of the city. The man at the center of this spectacle was Alexios Kyprianos, a former clerk in the imperial treasury. He had been accused of spreading unfounded accusations regarding the misuse of foreign loans secured to fortify the city walls. His words had reached the ears of Italian merchants whose favor the emperor desperately needed. The merchants demanded satisfaction, and the emperor, already balancing on the edge of political collapse, chose to sacrifice the speaker rather than risk the alliance. Alexios was brought from the prison at dawn, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His face was pale, but his eyes were fixed forward, refusing to meet the jeers or pity of those lining the streets. The air was cool, carrying the smell of salt from the nearby harbor, but the crowd was dense enough to make the square feel close and oppressive. The executioners wore no uniforms, only rough woolen tunics, their anonymity as much a protection as a sign that they served no one but the sentence itself. Beside them stood a court-appointed physician, a man whose role was to keep the condemned alive long enough for the punishment to be seen and understood by all. Before the act began, a herald stepped forward. In a voice that carried over the crowd, he recited the charges in formal Greek, accusing Alexios of speaking against the emperor's judgment and damaging the empire's reputation abroad. The charges were ceremonial. The outcome had been predetermined. When the herald finished, there was no question of appeal. Alexios was forced to his knees upon a pale stone platform, the surface worn smooth from centuries of similar proceedings. His head was tilted back, his mouth pried open with a carved wooden wedge. The physician stepped forward first, not to heal, but to prepare, gripping the tongue with iron tongs, pulling it forward until the muscle strained. The knife was small, its blade sharp and narrow. In the hands of the executioner, it moved with precision, severing the tongue in a single motion. The sound was muffled by the wedge, but the gasp that followed was unmistakable, a choked scream that turned wet and gurgling as blood filled Alexios's mouth. The crowd's reaction was not uniform. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, their faces expressionless, absorbing the scene as one might absorb a ritual that had always existed and would always exist. For in Byzantium, public punishment was not entertainment. It was political theater. The message was clear: the emperor's authority was absolute, and those who sought to undermine it would not only be punished, but marked for life. Once the tongue was cut, the physician cauterized the wound with a heated iron. The hiss of flesh meeting metal was sharp, accompanied by a rising scent of burned tissue that drifted across the square. Alexios's body shuddered violently, his hands straining against the shackles, but the guards held him in place until the cauterization was complete. When it was done, he was not allowed to collapse. The executioners hauled him to his feet, the blood still seeping through the linen gag that had been tied around his jaw. His clothing was simple, but now stained dark at the front where the fabric clung to him. He was paraded once around the square, the crowd given every opportunity to see the result of the punishment. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Merchants stood silently in the doorways of their stalls. The visual memory would outlast the day. The cruelty of glōssokopēsis was not only in the act itself, but in the life that followed. In the Byzantine court system, the ability to speak in one's own defense was essential. Without a voice, Alexios could no longer hold public office, plead a case, or give testimony. His words would exist only on paper, and even there they would carry less weight, for it was believed that the written word of a mutilated man bore the mark of disgrace. After the punishment, Alexios was not executed or imprisoned for life. Instead, he was released, banished from the capital but free to live in the provinces. It was an exile of a different kind. He walked among others, but could not engage them in the same way, forever reminded, and reminding others, of the price of speaking against the powerful. In the years that followed, his name appeared only in scattered monastery records, often without detail, as though the scribes themselves hesitated to commit the full story to paper. One account, preserved in the archives of a small monastery near Trebizond, notes simply, "He returned without his tongue, and so we understood what the city had done to him." The Augustaian square remained a place of ceremony, its pale stones cleansed, but never entirely free of memory. Those who had been there that day spoke of it in whispers for decades, not out of pity for Alexios, but out of caution, for the empire was listening, always listening, and the silence of the punished was its most eloquent warning. The mutilation had been meant to erase him. That was the logic of the Byzantine court. To take a man's tongue was not only to rob him of his speech, but to erase his capacity for influence. In the capital's political life, words were currency, persuasion was power, and silence was supposed to be exile without distance. Yet for Manuel Leontios, the punishment had an effect his enemies had not foreseen. He was maimed, yes. He could no longer stand in the assembly, debate in the council, or read imperial decrees aloud. But his survival, the fact that he still walked among the living after so public a humiliation, became a kind of provocation. It was 1436, a time when Constantinople was little more than a city-state hemmed in by Ottoman territory. Inside its walls, the emperor's grip on power rested on fragile coalitions, wealthy merchant families, military commanders guarding the land walls, and clerics whose sermons shaped public opinion. Manuel had been a minor official in the treasury, known more for his meticulous record keeping than for political ambition. But when he began to expose irregularities in the accounts, overpayments to favored merchants, grain shipments vanishing en route to the city, his fate was sealed. The punishment had been public, swift, and brutal. The Augustaian square had watched him bleed, watched the heated iron seal his wound, and watched him leave the platform less a man than a warning. From there, he had been dismissed from his post, stripped of any right to speak in court, and exiled from formal politics. What his enemies had not understood was that Manuel's presence alone was enough to keep his accusations alive. He could no longer speak, But he could walk the streets, meet the eyes of former colleagues, and write in the slow, deliberate hand of one who has no other means of expression. Even his silence was a reminder. For those who had seen the mutilation, every glimpse of him was a memory of what the empire feared. In the months that followed, he became a quiet fixture in the city's marketplaces. There, he would stand near the grain stalls, exchanging written notes with those who dared approach him. His questions were simple. Had shipments improved? Were prices fair? The answers were often cautious, but the act itself was defiance. The emperor's men noted his presence, but to arrest him again without cause risked drawing attention to the failure of his silencing. Inside the palace, his shadow lingered in other ways. Clerks who had once shared benches with him whispered his name, not in pity, but in a kind of wary respect. The mutilated man was not hiding. He was watching. His eyes seemed to follow them through the corridors, reminding them of the thin line between service and ruin. Rumors began to circulate, not of rebellion, but of resilience. Some claimed that Manuel had found ways to communicate without speaking, using gestures and written notes to convey ideas too dangerous for the tongue. Others said that foreign envoys, curious about the empire's practice of tongue cutting, had sought him out, asking in private about the state's inner workings. Whether true or not, the mere suggestion that he might still have influence was enough to unsettle the court. The emperor himself, though surrounded by flatterers, could not entirely dismiss these whispers. Byzantium in its final century was a place where authority was constantly under siege, not just from the encircling Ottomans, but from the court's own labyrinth of intrigue. A man who had endured the empire's most silencing punishment and yet remained present was, in his own way, dangerous, and so the palace sought to contain him without provoking sympathy. Orders were issued quietly. His movements were to be watched, his contacts recorded. The market stallholders who traded with him were questioned. Letters found in his possession were intercepted and copied before being returned. This was surveillance as suffocation, a slow tightening of the net rather than the sudden blow of an arrest. For Manuel, the reality was grim. His livelihood was gone. Many former acquaintances avoided him, fearful that even a passing word could draw suspicion. He lived in a small, crumbling house near the Blachernae walls, surviving on what little silver he had saved and the occasional assistance of sympathetic monks. Yet he refused to leave the city. Exile would have been safer, but safety was not his goal. His continued presence within the capital was his final act of defiance. Years passed. The mutilation scar faded to a pale mark inside his mouth, but its meaning never dulled. When famine returned to the city, when grain prices rose again beyond the reach of the poor, people remembered. They remembered the man who had once warned of such things, and how the empire had chosen to silence him rather than address the truth. The court, too, remembered. Some advisors urged the emperor to remove him entirely, to send him to one of the islands where inconvenient men were forgotten. But others counseled patience. Exile might turn him into a martyr in the eyes of the people. Better, they argued, to let him remain where the court could watch him. A prisoner in all but name. By the time Manuel's health began to fail, he had become more symbol than man. His silence had outlasted 2 imperial advisors, 1 patriarch, and countless market reforms. The empire itself teetered ever closer to collapse, yet here he remained, living proof that punishment could fail, that a voice could survive even when the body that carried it had been mutilated. He died in the winter of 1445, in his narrow bed near the Blachernae walls. The cause was likely illness, but no official record noted his passing. The palace allowed his burial without ceremony, but they could not erase the years of quiet resistance he had embodied. Those who remembered him did so not with pity, but with the uneasy respect one gives to a man who endures what others could not. By the mid-1440s, the Byzantine Empire was a withered remnant of its former self. The once great dominion of emperors and generals had shrunk to little more than Constantinople, and a scattering of coastal towns. Trade routes had been severed by Ottoman expansion. The treasury was perpetually empty, its coins debased to the point of insult. Yet within the palace, the greatest enemy was not the encircling armies, but the emperor's own fear. Manuel Leontios, the mutilated former treasury official, was no longer an active presence in the city's politics. His body had weakened, his movements slowed, but his memory lingered in the collective mind of the people. Those who remembered his warnings about corruption, famine, and the danger of selling the empire's future for short-term alliances now watched those very prophecies come to pass. Each grain shortage, each failed military levy seemed to confirm that the empire had silenced the wrong man. The emperor Constantine Palaeologos, though not directly responsible for Manuel's punishment, inherited its consequences. The maimed man had become an unspoken rallying point for dissent, not because he organized opposition, but because he existed as proof that truth in the empire was punished, not heeded. Merchants overcharged with impunity, governors hoarded resources, soldiers muttered about unpaid wages. In this atmosphere, paranoia became imperial policy. Trusted advisors were dismissed on suspicion of disloyalty. Governors who hesitated to send troops or taxes were accused of rebellion. The emperor's circle tightened to a handful of men whose loyalty was guaranteed by mutual dependence. Yet in that shrinking circle, betrayal was never far. By 1448, famine had struck again. Grain prices rose beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. In the poorer quarters, bread riots broke out, small at first, then growing bolder. These disturbances were met with force. Imperial guards patrolled the markets. Punishments were carried out in public squares, and rumors spread that the cutting block might soon be used again. In this climate, the memory of Manuel Leontios was not a warning against dissent. It was an inspiration for it. His name, once whispered cautiously, began to surface in conversations between merchants, soldiers, and provincial envoys. To invoke his name was to invoke the image of a man who had endured the empire's cruelty and lived to see its decline. Foreign envoys, too, knew of him. Venetian and Genoese merchants, always alert to signs of instability, noted in their reports the strange persistence of his story. In diplomatic exchanges, they would occasionally remind imperial negotiators that even your own truth-tellers have been silenced. It was a humiliation the emperor could not easily dismiss. Provinces began to drift. In the Morea, local rulers acted with increasing independence, ignoring imperial directives in favor of securing their own survival. On the Black Sea coast, fortresses that once pledged loyalty to Constantinople began negotiating directly with the Ottomans. Each defection deepened the emperor's suspicion that rebellion was not just possible, but inevitable. In the palace, Manuel's ghost, figurative though it was, became part of political calculation. Court officials, eager to protect themselves, accused rivals of harboring the sentiments of the mute. It was an accusation without formal definition, but its meaning was clear. The accused was being likened to the mutilated dissenter, a man who had challenged imperial authority. The irony was bitter. The punishment meant to erase Manuel from history had instead made his name a permanent weapon in the language of politics. The emperor's own health began to falter under the weight of his distrust. He ordered the strengthening of the Theodosian walls, though he lacked the resources to fully fund the work. Desperate appeals were sent to Western Europe for aid, but these were answered with conditions, religious concessions that only deepened divisions within the city. By 1451, the Ottomans under Mehmed Tiku were preparing for their decisive assault. In the tense months before the siege, Constantinople was a city of whispers. Every shortage of supplies, every delay in fortification, was met with the same fatal reminder Manuel Leontios had warned them. When the siege began in April 1453, the city's defenders fought with a mixture of desperation and fatalism. Manuel himself, by then an old and frail man, could do nothing but watch from his small home near the Blachernae walls. Witnesses later claimed that in the final weeks, people came to him, not for leadership, but to look upon the man who had spoken the truth and suffered for it, as if his endurance might lend them courage. The empire's end came swiftly after the walls were breached on May 29, 1453. The Ottomans poured into the city, and the last emperor fell in battle. For most citizens, the new rule meant survival, if not freedom. But in the days following the conquest, the fate of Manuel Leontios was quietly sealed. The Ottomans, though they had no personal quarrel with him, saw in his story a symbol of defiance against rulers, and such symbols were dangerous in any empire. He died within weeks of the city's fall, whether by illness, neglect, or deliberate abandonment is unknown. Yet even in death, the irony remained. His life had been defined by the empire's attempt to silence him. In the end, the empire itself fell silent before him. The walls still stood, the streets still bore their names, but the rulers who had feared his words were gone. For those who survived, Manuel's story became part of the private history of the city, told not in official chronicles, but in kitchens, marketplaces, and hidden rooms. The lesson was clear: an empire that fears its own truth is already dying, even if its walls have not yet fallen. The empire was no longer the unshakable monolith it once pretended to be. Its borders, once drawn with the confidence of conquest, had begun to fray like rotting cloth. Provinces that had for decades paid tribute in grain and gold now sent only sullen emissaries bearing demands instead of offerings. Armies returned from distant campaigns with fewer soldiers than they had departed, their armor rusting, their morale broken. The coinage was debased, the granaries stood nearly empty, and in the court the whispers had grown louder than the decrees. The emperor, once a figure of calculated terror, now appeared haunted. His eyes darted at every movement in the chamber. His hands trembled when placing his seal on official orders. He no longer trusted the generals he had raised, nor the ministers who once had been his instruments of control. Every man who stood too long in his presence became a suspect. Every rumor became a conspiracy in his mind. It was in this climate of desperation that the recall was ordered. The man who had been maimed years earlier, the one whose tongue had been cut out under the emperor's command, was no longer an exile in the political wilderness. In the minds of the desperate ministers, he had transformed into something else entirely: a talisman, a relic of a time when the empire had still been stable. To the populace, he had become the embodiment of endurance in the face of imperial cruelty. Even silent, his story had been repeated in markets and taverns, carried across provinces by traders and soldiers alike. No one dared to frame the recall as an admission of error, yet the truth was undeniable. The empire needed him. The summons arrived at the remote estate where he had been forced to live out his days, stripped of titles, lands, and the means to wield influence. The courier, flanked by guards, did not speak to him, not out of contempt, but because there was nothing to say. The seal of the emperor spoke loudly enough. The parchment demanded his immediate presence at the capital. When he entered the city, the transformation in its heart was unmistakable. The marble streets were cracked and overgrown in places. The once proud statues were chipped and defaced. Guards wore mismatched armor, and their faces betrayed hunger. The air no longer carried the scent of fresh incense from the temples, but the acrid smoke of unrest. And then there was the palace, the great symbol of imperial authority. Its gates stood open under a half-hearted guard. Once, entering these halls had meant passing through layers of ceremonial splendor, each corridor polished and watched over by disciplined soldiers. Now, shadows clung to the walls, and the courtiers who lingered did so with the nervousness of rats in a sinking ship. Those who had condemned him years ago were there to receive him. Age had not been kind to them, not in the way time lines efface, but in the way fear erodes the posture and dulls the eyes. They bowed, not out of respect, but because necessity had broken their pride. To them, he was no longer the dangerous voice that had challenged the emperor. He was the man whose silence could be weaponized again. This time in service of their survival, the emperor himself did not come to greet him. That meeting would come later, in private, when the sovereign could measure him in the quiet of a guarded chamber. For now, the silent man was led through the corridors to a council chamber that smelled faintly of dust and old ambitions. It was here that the truth of his recall became clear. The ministers, speaking in turns like gamblers placing their last bets, revealed the situation. Provinces were on the edge of secession. Armies refused to march without guarantees of pay and supplies. Foreign powers circled like carrion birds. The emperor, they admitted in cautious phrases, was losing control not just of the empire, but of his mind. They wanted the mute man's presence at court as a symbol, to show the people that even those once wronged by the throne could stand with it in its hour of need. It was, in their minds, a masterstroke of political theater. But the man they had summoned was not the one they remembered. Exile had stripped away more than his ability to speak. It had burned away the illusions he once held about the machinery of power. He had no loyalty left to the emperor who had mutilated him, nor to the council that had stood by and watched. Yet he understood power in a way they did not, that sometimes a symbol could be more dangerous than any army. He accepted their request, not with words, for he had none, but with a slow nod. The court took this as submission. In truth, it was calculation. That night, as he was given a chamber in the palace once more, he walked its dimly lit halls and noted how the silence had grown heavier than when he had last been here. The great empire was not merely in decline, it was dying, and he, the man they thought they had silenced forever, was now returned to its heart. It was no longer a question of whether he could speak. It was a question of what his silence would do. It began not with fanfare, but with whispers, the kind that slither through corridors where power is hoarded like gold and traded like poison. The empire had bled itself dry. Years of paranoia had eaten away at its foundations. The emperor's grip on the provinces was reduced to clenched fists on crumbling dust. Armies were defeated in campaigns that had no purpose beyond feeding his delusions. Cities, once glittering with wealth, were now hollow shells echoing with the sound of hunger. The nobility, desperate to save what little order remained, turned inward, searching for a figure who could hold the empire together. It was not loyalty that guided them. Loyalty had long since rotted into self-preservation. They did not look for the strongest warrior, nor the wisest scholar, nor even the most cunning politician. They searched for someone who could be controlled. Or so they believed, and in their search, their eyes fell upon the mutilated man. He had been cast out, stripped of voice, dignity, and the machinery of influence. Years had passed since his trial and mutilation. In their minds, his silence had turned him into something harmless, a broken relic of a bygone struggle. They did not see the quiet fire in his eyes, nor the fact that suffering had shaped him into something far more dangerous than a man with a voice. They saw only a mute shadow, someone they could use as a shield, a symbol, a puppet. The recall was framed as an act of reconciliation. Messengers were sent with sealed scrolls, their tone dripping with false honor. "The empire needs you once more," they wrote, as though they were summoning an old friend, and not the man they had brutalized to the edge of life. The offer was cloaked in respect, but beneath the words lay the same cold calculation that had condemned him years before. When he entered the palace, it was as though a ghost had walked into the throne room. Jaunt, draped in plain cloth, bearing the scars of his mutilation, he moved without the flourish of one seeking power. His presence was unadorned, yet the air thickened around him. The courtiers who had once laughed at his sentence now lowered their eyes. Some did so out of shame, others out of fear, and many because they could not bear to see the man who, by merely existing, reminded them of their complicity. It was not long before the whispers turned into open discussion among the nobility. The emperor was failing. His paranoia had crossed into madness. Each decision seemed designed not to preserve the empire, but to punish it. The food shortages worsened. Soldiers deserted. Border provinces declared independence. And so, the idea took root: if the voiceless man were crowned, he could serve as the figurehead for a united court, a neutral symbol around whom the fracturing nobility could rally. The plan was grotesque in its simplicity. They believed that without a tongue, he could not command armies in secret, could not deliver fiery speeches to the masses, could not weave plots in whispered chambers. A man robbed of speech was, in their eyes, a man robbed of ambition. He would wear the crown, but they would rule in his name. The coronation was unlike any the empire had seen before. There were no cheers from the people. They watched in tense silence, unsure whether to view the event as salvation or a cruel parody of justice. The palace's great hall was lined with soldiers, not to protect the new emperor, but to ensure order. The nobles stood in a semicircle, their robes heavy with jewels, their eyes sharp with expectation. He did not kneel to accept the crown. The crown was brought to him, an acknowledgement, however unintentional, that he no longer bowed to anyone. When the circlet of gold was lowered onto his head, the moment felt less like the ascent of a ruler and more like the sealing of a pact with a silent god of retribution. Those who had orchestrated this rise congratulated themselves in hushed conversations that very night. They imagined him as a pliant tool, a decorative shield against chaos. They told themselves that their wisdom had saved the empire, that they had plucked a relic from exile and transformed him into a figure of unity. They were blind to the truth. The crown they had placed upon his head was not a leash, it was a weapon. For the mute emperor understood something they did not. Words can be silenced, but presence cannot. The court could not erase the image of his mutilation, nor could they erase the fact that he had survived it. In a world where betrayal was spoken in whispers, he was the only one who needed no speech to convey his defiance. His stillness became a mirror in which the court saw their own treachery reflected. His silence was not weakness. It was a void that drew in their fears, their suspicions, their doubts. The people, too, began to murmur. Here was a man who had stood before the empire's cruelty and endured. He had been broken, yet had returned, not to beg, but to rule. His crown was not forged in gold, but in suffering, and it gleamed with a light more dangerous than any sword. And so, the nobility's illusion began to fracture from the moment they placed that crown upon his head. They had intended to create a ruler without a voice. What they had created instead was an emperor whose silence could command more than words ever could. When the mutilated man took the throne, there were no triumphant fanfares, no speeches of gratitude to the gods, and no declarations of loyalty from the court. The coronation was a quiet, unsettling ceremony. The imperial diadem, heavy with jewels and centuries of history, was placed upon his brow in a hall so still that the faint clink of metal echoed like a bell. The courtiers, dressed in their finery, avoided looking directly at him. They remembered the day they had watched his tongue fall to the ground, slick with blood, and they could not reconcile that broken figure with the man who now sat upon the throne. From the moment he ascended, his silence became the empire's new language. Gone were the grand assemblies where emperors once spoke to the people from marble balconies. Gone were the public trials where enemies were humiliated before the mob. Instead, messages arrived sealed in wax, carried by hand-picked envoys whose loyalty was ensured not by gold, but by fear. Every decree was a short, perfectly measured sentence written in his own hand. No one knew where he drafted them. Some believed he wrote by candlelight in a hidden chamber. Others whispered that he did not write at all, but merely gestured to scribes in a code known only to him. The absence of his voice made every gesture a matter of speculation. A lifted brow could mean approval. A pause before signing a decree could mean a death sentence. Ministers who had once thrived on flattery now dreaded his gaze, for in silence there was no chance to explain, no way to soften a mistake. A single glance from him could send a man to the frontier, or to the executioner. Foreign emissaries arrived expecting to exploit his muteness, only to leave unsettled. In the reception hall, he would sit immobile on the throne while translators spoke on his behalf. His eyes never wavered, his expression unreadable. The silence pressed upon them like a physical weight, and many confessed later that they preferred negotiating with a man who shouted. Because at least then, they knew where they stood. His reign's first act was to purge the palace of the emperor's former loyalists. Not through open trials, but through quiet disappearances. Courtiers went to sleep in silk-covered beds and were found days later, floating face down in the river. Others were sent on diplomatic missions to distant provinces and never returned. No one ever saw him give the order. The deaths simply happened, and people learned not to ask why. Those who survived were rewarded not with titles or riches, but with proximity. To be allowed into his presence was the new currency of power. Banquets became hushed affairs where courtiers strained to read his expression while he dined in complete silence. Even the sound of utensils on plates was muted, for servants were trained to place and remove dishes without a single clink. The entire court, once a place of gossip and laughter, became a theater of whispers and measured glances. Beyond the palace walls, his rule spread like a shadow. Tax collectors found themselves dismissed if they were accused of extortion, not through trial, but through the sudden arrival of a sealed order. Provincial governors, accustomed to bribing their way into favor, discovered that money no longer guaranteed safety. The emperor's justice was unpredictable and unchallengeable, and that unpredictability was its greatest weapon. The people, too, adapted to their ruler's silence. Street criers no longer announced imperial speeches, for there were none. Instead, tablets inscribed with decrees were hung in the marketplaces, guarded by soldiers whose faces betrayed nothing. The public learned to read between the lines of those decrees. A slight change in phrasing could signal a shift in power, a war brewing, or an impending purge. Farmers, artisans, and merchants all became political interpreters, for survival depended on understanding what was not said. There were those who believed his silence was a mask, hiding a mind consumed by revenge. Others argued that the mutilation had given him a clarity no other ruler possessed. Freed from the noise of flattery and self-defense, he ruled only with the precision of necessity. Whatever the truth, the empire's machinery began to bend to his will. Trade routes were secured, rebellions were crushed before they could gain momentum, and the treasury swelled under his meticulous administration. Yet there was a darker cost. The fear that had once radiated from the previous emperor's outbursts now seeped into every corner of society. But it was a different kind of fear. It was not the fear of violence seen and heard. It was the fear of the unseen, the unspoken, the knowledge that one's fate could be sealed in absolute quiet. Years into his reign, there were still those who remembered his trial without words, the public mutilation, the exile. They remembered the man stripped of his dignity and returned it to him in whispers, turning his suffering into legend. For the common people, he became a symbol that cruelty could be endured, and that endurance could outlast the hand that inflicted it. But for the nobility, he was something else entirely, a living reminder of what happened to those who underestimated the voiceless. They had crowned him thinking they were placing a puppet on the throne, a man incapable of stirring rebellion. Instead, they had given power to a ruler who had mastered the art of ruling without saying a single word. And so, the empire adapted. The marble halls echoed not with speeches, but with the sound of sandals on stone. The court bent under the weight of unbroken stairs, and in the heart of the palace, the emperor sat, a man without a tongue, ruling a world that now spoke his language: silence. History rarely records the quietest acts of vengeance. They leave no battlefields, no declarations, no bloodied banners waving in the wind. Instead, they linger like a slow poison in the bloodstream of a kingdom, felt rather than seen. The man who now sat on the imperial throne, the man once dragged into a court that stripped him of his voice, had no need for speeches. His revenge would not roar, it would whisper, and the whisper would suffocate. The palace was still, its marble corridors lined with men and women who had learned to speak less and watch more. It was in that stillness that the disappearances began. At first, they seemed like accidents. An aging senator who failed to wake one morning, a provincial governor thrown from his horse during a hunt, a court advisor struck down by a sudden illness. None of these events merited public mourning beyond the formalities. Death was a constant companion in an empire this vast. But in the shadows, where memories are longer and suspicion sharper, the pattern began to take shape. The men who had once stood in that candlelit trial chamber, the ones who had smiled as the sentence was read, the ones who had nodded in agreement when the knife met flesh, were vanishing. One by one, they slipped from life as quietly as he now ruled. The imperial scribes kept no records of accusations, no transcripts of inquiries. Their deaths were treated as the natural turning of fate's wheel, but the courtiers knew better. Fate had nothing to do with it. He was methodical. Years had taught him patience. His exile had been a study in waiting, in learning how to endure while others underestimated him. And now, as emperor, He used the same patience to dismantle his enemies without ever touching them. Orders passed through layers of loyal intermediaries, each acting without knowing the full design. A name would be spoken to a trusted guard. Weeks later, that man would vanish. No trail, no witnesses, no questions. The palace's most seasoned schemers began to fear the very silence they had once mocked. They had believed a man without a tongue to be powerless, incapable of manipulation or command. But in stripping him of speech, they had taught him something far more dangerous: how to wield absence as a weapon. A missing word, a withheld gesture, a glance that lingered too long. These became his language, and in that language he authored their deaths. Whispers spread among the servants, for servants always see what the powerful wish to hide. They spoke of a chamber in the far wing of the palace, one never entered except under darkness. Of a sealed box in the emperor's private quarters, containing names written by another's hand. A list that grew shorter with each passing season. Whether such a box existed was irrelevant. The fear of it was enough to bind the court in obedience. The wider empire noticed the change as well. Provincial lords who had once been brazen in their greed suddenly grew cautious. Ambitious generals found excuses to remain far from the capital. The merchants who supplied the palace sent gifts of unusual value, not as tribute, but as insurance. No one wanted their name to be the next unspoken verdict, and yet, to the outside world, his reign appeared orderly, even prosperous. Grain shipments reached famine-struck regions on time. The imperial roads, long neglected, were repaired. Trade increased. Taxes were collected without rebellion. He gave the people stability, even as the court lived in a state of quiet dread. It was this balance, public order, private terror, that made his revenge invisible to history's loudest chroniclers. Those who had harmed him never faced public humiliation. No executions in the square, no trials in the great hall. Their absence was their punishment. Sudden, unexplained, and complete. To the common citizen, they had simply ceased to exist. To the nobility, their absence was a warning carved deep into the marrow of the court the emperor remembers. The last of them, the high magistrate who had pronounced the sentence against him years before, lingered longest. Perhaps the emperor saved him for last, or perhaps fate, in this one instance, played its hand. When his death came, it was not by poison or blade, but by fear itself. The magistrate, finding himself increasingly isolated, began refusing food, convinced every bite was laced with his end. He dismissed his servants, boarded his chamber windows, and refused audiences. His body was found weeks later, gaunt and lifeless, locked inside a room no one dared enter. Officially, it was starvation. Unofficially, it was the emperor's most perfect act of retribution. The man had killed himself out of terror, without the emperor ever lifting a hand. By the time the last conspirator was gone, there were no speeches, no celebrations, no acknowledgement from the throne. He simply carried on ruling. His court now composed of those who understood the cost of disloyalty. They did not need to hear his voice to understand his will. In later generations, when scribes set quill to parchment to record the emperor's reign, they wrote of stability, of restored order, of the quiet dignity with which he governed. They did not mention the vanished names, the sudden deaths, the fear that hung over every noble feast. But in the private diaries of those who lived through it, a different truth was preserved. The emperor's revenge was not heard in words or seen in spectacle. It was felt, like the slow tightening of a noose that no one dared to touch. And so, history would remember him not as the mutilated man who survived, but as the silent emperor who ruled through absence, and whose vengeance was complete before anyone dared to say it had begun. He died in the early hours of a winter morning, his body lying still beneath layers of heavy imperial silk. The palace was quiet, not the solemn quiet of reverence, but the watchful silence of those unsure how history would remember the man who had ruled them without uttering a single public word. The courtiers moved like ghosts through the corridors, their steps muffled on cold marble. No one wept loudly. Mourning him required a careful balance, enough to appear loyal, but never so much as to suggest genuine devotion. The official records, prepared within hours, were meticulous in their restraint. They praised his stability, his restraint, his measured governance. They lauded his reign as one of order after chaos, of strength after weakness. Yet, even in their praise, there was an absence, a deliberate erasure of the cruelty that had forged his path to power. The mutilation, the exile, the silent return, all of it was compressed into vague phrases like a period of adversity or years of reflection. No mention was made of the disappearances, the poisonings, the quiet punishments that had swept through the court in the early years of his rule. No scribe dared to record the whispered belief that every decision he made was sharpened by the memory of his own suffering. The empire's official memory became a tapestry woven from omissions. Yet beyond the palace walls, the story was harder to contain. Among the people, in the marketplaces, in the barracks, in the smoky corners of taverns, his life had become legend. To some, he was the mute king, a victim who had turned his humiliation into strength, a ruler who needed no words because his mere presence commanded obedience. To others, he was a shadow in human form, a man who had let his personal vengeance bleed into the affairs of the empire, ruling through fear and silent retribution. Generations later, historians would find themselves trapped between these two visions. The surviving records, heavily edited by imperial censors, offered little truth. Some scholars saw in him a figure of tragic dignity, a man who proved that resilience could conquer cruelty. Others argued that his silence had been as dangerous as the most eloquent tyrant's tongue. Without words, there had been no transparency, no accountability, only decrees delivered like blows from the dark. What was certain was this: his reign changed the nature of imperial power. After him, no emperor could rule without understanding the weight of perception. The mute king proved that authority did not require speeches or public persuasion, only the cultivation of fear, respect, and inevitability. In the decades following his death, successors would try to imitate that quiet authority, but without the same scars, without the same legend. Their silence felt weak rather than terrifying. In the provinces, monuments were erected to him, some by loyalists, others by those who sought to claim his memory for their own causes. In one city, a statue showed him seated on a throne, head high, his mouth closed in defiance. In another, he was depicted as a tragic martyr, holding a broken chain. Each image told a different truth, and each was both right and wrong. But perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy was not in stone or scrolls, but in the stories told by those who had lived through his reign. Soldiers told of the way he would pass through the ranks, saying nothing, yet leaving them feeling as though they had been measured and judged. Merchants spoke of his uncanny ability to favor certain markets with a single nod, altering the flow of wealth without ever speaking a word. Assassins, those who survived, whispered that his court was the most dangerous in living memory, not because of open executions, but because of the quiet disappearances no one dared to question. In the centuries that followed, the empire would fracture and reunite. Dynasties would rise and fall, and yet his name remained, not always spoken, but always there, a ghost in the annals of history. Some rulers claimed descent from him to legitimize their power, others denounced him as a symbol of oppression, using his story to rally rebellions. The truth, if there ever was one, became impossible to untangle. Perhaps he had been both victim and villain. Perhaps his reign had been both a time of stability and a reign of terror. What was undeniable was that he had reshaped the empire's understanding of what a ruler could be and what they could survive. In the end, the mute king's most lasting achievement was not the peace he maintained or the enemies he destroyed. It was the lesson he left behind. That power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it says nothing at all.